Hello, my name is Joel Hanhart. Today I'm going to talk about Yucca Mountain alternatives. This is the second part in the three-part series. The first one was covered by Daniel, so if you missed that one, make sure and check that one out. And then the video to watch after mine would be Nathaniel's. Make sure you check all three of those out. Before we get into talking about alternatives, we should know what Yucca Mountain is. So Yucca Mountain is considered a deep geological repository. And deep geological repositories rely on barriers, layered barriers in defense. The first barrier is an engineered barrier. That's what we put the nuclear waste into before it goes into the repository. These are high quality, high steel barriers. And the second barrier is the geology of the site itself. These sites are usually bored deep into bedrock, rock formations such as granite or some type of clay. So they have really good characteristics for shielding. Another type is in salt beds, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So for potential alternatives, before we get into things that we could use now, let's talk about some of the ideas that came up in the past that we are not using today. The first one is outer space disposal. Sounds like a really good idea. It's a permanent way to get rid of the waste. What you do is put all the waste into a rocket, shoot it into space, gone forever. However, unfortunately, it costs a lot of money to get a rocket into space. So it's cost prohibitive. And the other reason that we don't use outer space disposal is because launching a rocket is not always a successful enterprise. So a launch failure of a rocket in space could spread that nuclear waste on the Earth, and that's not what we want. A couple other options that people have thought about: disposal at sea and disposal at subduction zones. They're very similar, so we'll talk about them together. Both of those are not allowed by international agreements. The international communities have come together, and everybody agrees that these two ways are not good. Disposal at sea is just what it sounds like. You take nuclear waste off the coast and dump it in the sea. And then disposal at subduction zones. So basically, when the Earth's tectonic plates are moving, when two plates come together, one will slide underneath the other plate. So the idea was drill a deep hole into the subducting plate and put the nuclear waste in that hole, cover it back up, and then as that plate moves under the other plate, it will draw the waste with it deep into the Earth and dispose of it that way. Unfortunately, most subduction zones are at sea, and again, disposal of nuclear waste at sea is not allowed. So both of those are not being used. The third one there is rock melting, and what that is, it's drilling a deep hole into a rock formation, putting the waste in that, and then the idea was if we could get the waste itself and the surrounding rock to melt, then that would spread the waste out over the melted area, and then when that rock cools again, it would form solid rock, and that would dispose of the waste. So how do you get rock that's that deep in the earth to melt and then cool again? The only way that anybody could come up with is to detonate a nuclear warhead. So not only are you putting nuclear waste into a very deep hole, you're also putting a nuclear warhead into a deep hole and then detonating that to get that rock to melt. And the international community has agreed that the proliferation of nuclear weapons is not something that should be pursued. So that method is also not being pursued. So let's talk about some things that we might be able to do. We might be able to do a long-term on-site storage. Right now, most spent fuel in the United States is stored in cooling ponds that are near the reactors that they came out of. This fuel can be in there for up to 40 or 50 years, and then after that time period it could be transferred to dry casks, which are stored above ground or in shallow areas just below the surface. Again, these are robust engineered barriers, usually steel lined concrete barriers. So after this amount of time and the barriers that they're put in, the containments that they're put in, there's very low radiation and effects from leakage. Excuse me. So how do we make this a viable option? It's not a viable option right now because this wasn't intended to be a long-term thing. This was only, we're going to keep them in these cooling ponds and then transfer the nuclear waste to the repository. But the repository is not going, so what do? There's some companies that have already started this dry cask storage, but it's still meant to be an interim step. So to make this a long-term option, nuclear waste fund fees used for dry cask storage. Everybody that uses electricity generated from nuclear power pays a fee on top of the electrical fee to fund the nuclear waste fund. So this money could be diverted from this waste fund and used to help companies with the dry cask storage. Right now the license fees, which are separate from the reactor operating licenses, they're only for 20 years. So in order to make this a longer term solution, those license times would have to be longer. And we might also consider consolidated storage areas. You have several reactors in an area, you could bring those all into one place, and that would reduce the cost that it costs to maintain that type of area, and would also increase the security if everything's in one spot. So, might try this. Another alternative that we might try is to expand the waste isolation pilot plant. The waste isolation pilot plant is for low and moderate level waste, mostly government nuclear waste. And the waste isolation pilot plant, it relies only on the geology of the site. Now what the waste isolation pilot plant is it's a deep salt mine, and the reason that we might be able to use this as an alternative is because there's lots of salt deposits in the United States, big salt deposits. They're geologically stable. They've been there for a long time. If there's a salt bed, that means that area is stable. If the area is not stable and the plates are moving around, then the salt gets washed away. Also, again, washed away, salt beds are absent water. There's no water. If there was water, the water would wash the salt away and there wouldn't be a salt bed there. And the shielding characteristics of the salt is similar to concrete, so it's pretty good shielding. So how do we make this from not viable, which is not now, to a viable option? The way we would do this is use the engineered barriers for layer defense. Right now, the barriers for the waste isolation plant is just the geology. The waste goes into regular steel drums or low quality steel boxes before it gets put into the site. If we were to use robust engineering practices for containments and then put those containments into the geology that supports it, this would be a good option. Another alternative we have to just getting rid of the waste is to reprocess the waste. The U.S. reprocesses, right now, it's only for government purposes. There's about 90,000 metric tons that have been reprocessed throughout the world, but the United States doesn't do any commercial reprocessing. This reprocessing could save up to 30% of the natural uranium and reduce the volume to 1/5 of the original volume. It doesn't dispose of it, but it we could reduce it and reuse it. We could also consider international agreements. Canada projects to 2035 for opening their waste disposal site. Some European countries have deposits that will open in 10 to 15 years. Russia and Japan are closer than other areas. So we should be able to come to some kind of agreement where countries that are closer to a depository help other countries, or those countries help them in exchange for room in their depository. Of course, these agreements should be voluntary, and it should be reviewed by the international community, probably the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, for viability to make sure all the waste standards are met. So that's all I have for you. Make sure to check out Nathaniel's video next. Thank you.